Welcome to the OPC's program on Ukraine. Our title is Putin May Win Back Ukrainian Territory, but not Ukrainian parts. And Jim Brooke, a longtime OPC member, suggested that we have this very program. It's your times, and he'll be our moderator. And Jim worked for 8 years in Moscow and 6 in Kyiv before returning to the Berkshires, where he is now. And Jim is now a visiting fellow for Russia-Ukraine at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. So now I hand it over to Jim. Thank you, all the panelists, for joining us today.
Great, Patty, and thanks for setting us up. It really is wonderful. Well, as my friends in Ukraine can see, I'm wearing my Vyshyvanka today. I hope it's not a morning after reaction, but we got the terrible news of the recognition of the two separatist areas as independent countries by Putin, and a kind of wild speech denying Ukraine's sovereignty last night. And we're very lucky. I've assembled essentially 3 friends of mine from Kyiv, from my 6 years in Kyiv, from left to right, Myroslava Hartmond, Peter Dickinson, and Brian Mefford. All have spent, well, collectively many years, each at least 20 years in Ukraine, and know the score very well. Brian, love to get you on first. Brian is a political consultant. He has been reading the polls about public opinion in Ukraine for at least 20 years. He understands that Ukraine is a moving target. And my original title for this talk was Not Your Grandmother's Ukraine, that what people think about Ukraine, which they learned in the 1980s, early 90s, is very different. Brian, could you bring us up to date on what Ukrainians are thinking, where they're going, where their heads are?
Sure. Thank you, Jim. So, it goes without saying this is the topic on everyone's minds. I mean, everyone's talking about it, thinking about it. But that being said, Ukrainian people have been very resilient, and there's not been the panic that you might expect if you read the headlines in the Western newspapers. I mean, it's good that there is attention on Ukraine, but the reality on the ground is that people are keeping, a steady hand. They have made preparations for the worst, but they continue to go about their daily activities, and they're proud of the country. They're not backing down. So I think that speaks really well to the nation that Ukraine is today. If this had happened, in the 1990s, I'm not sure that Ukraine would be as resilient as it is now. But you have an entire generation of people born after the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, everyone under the age of 30, 31 has no recollection of that. And that has changed a lot of the psychosis. Also, the Orange Revolution, and then later Euromaidan, has changed the country because people saw that they could stand up for themselves. And if they stayed together, stayed united, then they could have a European future and a European standard of living. Ukraine is not the Ukraine that it was. It's not your father's Oldsmobile, as Jim, you and I would recall. And I think one very important metric to remember is this is the first year that the minimum wage in Ukraine is actually higher than the minimum wage in Russia. And that's it's a huge metric, because what it means is when you have a democratic system, where you have decentralized government and all these reforms that have been taking place, a difficult process, but have been taking place particularly over the last 8 years, that raises everyone's standard of living. So, no one likes working on minimum wage, but the point is, if the minimum wage in Ukraine is higher than Russia, then that means that the market is working, and the freedom's being dispersed, the economics are being dispersed. And that's a threat to Russia. A democratic and prosperous Ukraine, where Ukrainians have a higher standard of living, they can travel to the EU whenever they want without a visa. Russians don't have that. And that is part of what this situation is currently about.
Yeah, Brian, thank you. 2 quick points. You're in Lviv, had been living in Kyiv. Is there a certain migration, given the pressure from the east, of some people are positioning themselves in the far western city of Lviv, which is only 45 minutes an hour from Poland? What are you seeing in Lviv?
So a lot of this started when the five embassies, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, when they relocated to Lviv in varying stages. But yes, obviously there's a noticeable diplomatic presence there. And then a number of expats have also decided to maybe bring their families there or to work there, because the upside of COVID is everyone's learned to work remotely. So that continues to apply in this situation. The US, of course, last night decided to move their personnel out of Lviv into Poland. But yes, there is a noticeable uptick in foreigners in Lviv at this time. And, I think that, everyone has to do what's in their own interest, take care of their own families, their careers, businesses, and so forth. But people are saying, no, we're staying. And I think it's particularly encouraging when you see the Ukrainian people who maybe don't have the finances or opportunities to leave that an expat would have, but they're the ones that are the most confident in staying in Ukraine. And that's very important. Great.
Yeah, I saw a friend of mine was advertising on an expat forum to buy a car, which I guess just get some mobility. Everybody, when I was introduced to Brian maybe 8 years ago, he was introduced as the only American in Kyiv who liked to have drinks with members of parliament, members of the Rada. Brian, you have very good context inside the Rada. Do you think the collapse of Putin's political project last February with the basically detention of Medvedchuk and closing down his two stations? Viktor Medvedchuk, for everyone's knowledge, is very simply, his daughter is the goddaughter of Putin. And so Medvedchuk, for the last 5 years, has been Putin's agent in Kyiv. He had special rights to fly in a private jet between Moscow and Kyiv. Do you think that with the crackdown on Medvedchuk last February, the closing of his stations, the confiscation of his pipeline, his wife's refinery, that Putin gave up on the political option, which he'd been nursing for several years, and the idea of the federal Ukraine, where he'd get the separatists inside the Rada as a sort of veto power against NATO and that sort of thing?
Well, the thing about Putin is he is quite persistent. And he never commits himself to just having one plan. There's, as I say, a lot of ways to, skin a cat, and that's certainly true with Putin. So when one project fails, doesn't work, then he will reinvest in, his resources in another project, and we're seeing that now. Certainly, the fact that the Zelensky administration played a tough line with Viktor Medvedchuk, tougher than we've seen ever in Ukraine's history. That probably had some impact on, the decisions Putin's making because of the family connection and Medvedchuk complaining to him. But by tightening up on Medvedchuk, of course, it also has limited Russia's influence levers, both in the media and financially, that they often have exerted over Ukraine, which is perhaps one of the reasons why Ukrainians are staying united and strongly backing their country.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's move to you, Myroslava. And Myroslava is famous for researching the soft power of Ukraine. She's studied, and I think she's working on a doctorate from Oxford, as I recall. And she ran an art salon in Kyiv, one of my favorite places to go, the Triptych Gallery. And Myroslava really has her finger on the cultural pulse of where Ukrainians' heads are. So if you could take it from here, Myroslava.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. Well, our gallery has been closed, unfortunately, since the pandemic hit, and I don't see it reopening anytime soon, given the current situation. I don't think luxury retail is very much on everyone's minds. But I do hope to share some insights that I've gained from the past 8 years of my time in Ukraine. Because I have such a limited time, I can't really go into all the different amazing things that have been happening in Ukraine's culture over the past years. So instead, I wanted to offer three main narratives that we've seen emerge in Ukrainian culture at large. So this is everything from pop music to urban design to the visual arts, whether in cinema, music video production, or indeed the fine arts. Well, the first one is that we have certainly seen a change in Ukraine's relationship to its Soviet past. There has been a tendency in recent years, especially among the Ukrainian cultural elite of the new generation, to embrace certain aspects of Soviet heritage. So on the left, we see a Soviet mosaic from the 70s, from Prospect Peremohi. There is a whole line of very distinctive Soviet panel buildings with these elaborate mosaic decorations. One of them has fallen under a lot of criticism, not this one, because it shows the coat of arms of the USSR in a very kind of elaborate, colorful, psychedelic interpretation. On the right, this is a contemporary artist and fashion designer, Yulia Bilaeva, and she has indeed designed a line of swimwear which takes images of Ukrainian Soviet mosaics. Following the Euromaidan, there was a process of the destruction of Soviet monuments that we've seen many Lenin statues overturned, and this was known as the Lenin Fall. And there was a general impression that Soviet aesthetics were very unwelcome, but because there's such an important fiber, such an important thread in the urban fiber in Ukraine, in the capital, as well as really all over the country, including Lviv. There is some fantastic Soviet monumental art in Lviv. There has been a kind of move towards embracing those aesthetics as a kind of important part in the development of Ukraine. Having said that, choosing to protect monumental artworks by essentially Ukrainian artists who were commissioned during the Soviet period to carry out these works does not mean that this younger generation of Ukrainians are aligning themselves with the ideology of the Soviet Union. So there's been this huge divorce between aesthetics and ideology. We embrace the aesthetics insofar as it's not actual insignia of the Soviet state, but we certainly distance ourselves from the ideology. So in fact, seeing these aesthetics as part of new cultural products has been a way of kind of processing that past. Another thing which we've seen recently is that feminist ideas and ideas about the human body, and in particular the female body, have really entered the mainstream discourse in Ukraine. And on the left is a very famous painting by Taras Shevchenko, the national poet of Ukraine, Ukraine's Shakespeare. In many ways, Ukraine's Thomas Jefferson too, because of course he carried his works, his poetry and prose carried a lot of political ideas on the foundation of the Ukrainian national state. This is his own painterly illustration to the poem Katerina, which tells the story of the downfall of a Ukrainian girl who gave her heart to a Cossack, seen in the background, getting away from her and leaving her pregnant and of course alienated from the community. On the left is a recent performance by a Ukrainian artist, Alice de Luna, who in fact spent just under a decade studying in the UK, and she chose, like me, to come back to Ukraine after the Euromaidan, after the revolution. So we see two very different examples of Ukrainian women with a very, very different cultural context, and of course a very different relationship to their own body. This is significant because in many ways, the rise of women's rights and of feminist ideas has helped a lot of Ukrainians to redefine the way they see not only personal relationships, but also political relationships. Ukraine's relationship to Russia can in many ways be seen in terms of a codependent, abusive relationship that Ukraine is trying to distance herself from. Of course, Ukraine is conceptualized very much as female, as a woman, as a feminine entity. In Putin's recent speech, he quoted the popular adage, whether нравится, не нравится, терпимая красавица. So like it or not, you're going to have to put up with it, beauty. And of course, this was something that President Zelensky responded to, saying, you know, that this was not the kind of language that Ukraine was going to put up with anymore. And this is very important because, of course, just as Ukraine sees Russia in terms of historic abuse and oppression, Russia very much sees Ukraine as the unwilling but legitimate spouse of Russia. Another important change that we've seen is the evolution of the cultural diplomatic policy of the Ukrainian state. So on the left, we have the famous Spirit of Ukraine statue that decorates the Euromaidan, probably one of the images of Ukrainian women that has been most widely televised around the world, because of course the protests unfolded around this column celebrating Ukrainian statehood. And it's executed in a very throwback style of kind of Ukrainian Cossack neo-Baroque. So there's a lot of gold, there are a lot of folk elements, obviously, and there is a very retro, retro, we're talking 17th, 18th century retro aesthetic. So very much looking towards the past and trying to give Ukraine a chance to reestablish herself historically as well as aesthetically. And of course, on the right, many of you will recognize Goe's Shum video. This is the song with which they didn't win the Eurovision Song Contest last year, but they, I think, were the most memorable act by a mile. And we're seeing a very, very different kind of image of Ukraine that has been sanctioned by the Ukrainian state. So it's countercultural, it's fun, it's militaristic, it's steampunk, it's kind of Ukrainian Matrix on steroids in Chernobyl. And of course, the song itself drew inspiration from Ukrainian folklore. It's a so-called Vesnyanka, or spring chant, that was meant to draw in harvest. So again, folkloric themes, but interpreted very differently. If on the left, we have a very literal interpretation, on the right, we have something very fluid, very modern, and arguably something that has a wide appeal. So it's not, strictly speaking, it's not just meant for national consumption. It's something that is legible globally amongst a new generation of culture lovers. I very much agree with Brian's remark regarding the fact that there is now a generation of Ukrainians who remember neither a Soviet past nor a time when we were Russia by extension, in the sense that we consumed most of the cultural product that we consumed, whether that was TV or films or music, was Russian. They very much are living in a Ukrainian society where Ukraine is as widely spoken in even the most Russian-speaking parts. I think Ukrainian is as widely spoken now in the public realm. That is really, I think, the backbone of the new cultural product, because culture is becoming increasingly younger, and even the interpretation of cultural giants such as Shevchenko is increasingly younger. And lastly, to conclude, I think it's very important to realize that Russia and Ukraine have diametrically opposed cultural paradigms. The fact that Ukraine has a distinct culture in the eyes of Russia does not mean that Ukraine deserves state sovereignty. Russia is a federation. It includes essentially thousands of ethnic groups with their own very distinct cultures and languages in many cases. And that, as far as Russia is concerned, is not an argument. You could also argue that Kyiv has a more important place, or as important a place in Russian history as does Moscow in Ukraine's history, because of course this is where the medieval city-state that was the Kyiv Rus originated. The Ukrainian urban fabric contains buildings of very different historical periods. This is St. Andrew's Church. It was designed by an Italian architect. built by a Russian architect, and of course it absorbed influences from Ukrainian Cossack Baroque, and it is a global landmark, but it is of course a Ukrainian church, but it has so many ties, and like really the best examples of Ukrainian urban culture, it's very cosmopolitan in its outlook. So my closing thought, of course, is that we see the kind of coverage that Ukraine is receiving now. It's, I would say, I mean, Peter would probably be able to comment on this more authoritatively, but I would argue that the Ukraine crisis is much, much more prominent than the Euromaidan was. The reason being, Russia is the antagonist. Russia has the leading role still. People still see Ukraine in terms of its relationship to Russia. And the fact that Ukraine has a distinct culture does not necessarily help Russia to put this abusive, codependent relationship in the past, even though I think Ukraine is more than ready to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Myroslava. Very interesting. And her gallery is just to the left of that beautiful church, which went through it's a lovely restoration. And whoever goes to Kyiv should definitely go see it, St. Andrews. And just to put a nail on the head, many people would say that Putin's comments last week, was the language of a rapist, essentially. I mean, it's someone who wants to force himself on someone else in a male-female setting. And to quantify the Lenin Fall, which is a fascinating phenomenon. And Myroslava, I remember at your gallery, you hosted that Swiss photographer who traveled around the country, and he did a book documenting many of the 1,300 Lenin statues that have been taken down in Ukraine in the last 8 years. And some of them are like holding up carports, and some of them are in the basements of museums. Some of them are just face down in a flower bed. But it's been a thoroughgoing sort of purging of Lenin. The only two Lenin statues still standing are in Chernobyl, which is maintained as kind of a Soviet theme park for largely foreign tourists, an hour and a half north of Kyiv, and hopefully the Russian troops will not come through there. On that note, Myroslava, about Russian troops, there is this phenomenon. Kyiv can be called the largest Russian-speaking city outside of Russia. You and I, all of us know it's a bilingual city, increasingly bilingual, and just about everybody in Kyiv speaks Ukrainian. And for many, it's their first language, if not most. Why do you think that Putin cannot understand the concept of the Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriot?
Well, as I mentioned, if the existence of this distinct language and a distinct culture was recognized as the sole basis for sovereignty, then that would herald the end of Russia as a federal state, because there are so many distinct cultures and distinct languages within the Russian Federation.
Russia has been called the prison of nations with their 82 units. And frankly, the fact that Myroslava, you and I are speaking English does not make me English, at least. It is an English language, but Putin's view is anyone who speaks Russian as their native language should be answering to him. I don't answer to Queen Elizabeth II. I'm dismayed she has Omicron, but she's not my head of state. So Putin doesn't get that. Anyone who speaks Russian, whether in Latvia or Kazakhstan or Ukraine, should be answering to him. And this is part of his project to recreate Russia, the Soviet Union, without the communist part. Peter, you wrote a wonderful essay. Really, you burned it out last night in response to Putin's speech, which I haven't read yet. I've read your essay, I haven't read his speech yet. Could you tell us where you think things are going and what was the significance of that speech? Was he verbalizing his essay of last summer, which the 7,000-word essay where he denied Ukrainian sovereignty? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what he said yesterday was pretty much a repeat of what was written in that essay. Certainly, if not the exact same words, then the same spirit. Certainly, I think it was notable, A, because of the context of the speech, and B, because of the manner in which it was delivered. I mean, he was agitated. He was clearly emotional. At one point, he actually had to say, "I'm not emotional," which was a bit of a giveaway. This is not an emotional take. He was clearly emotional. He's clearly, frankly speaking, I mean, the comments online, people called it unhinged, deranged, a rant. I think it shocked a lot of people. There was actually, I was just reading now on The Guardian, they wrote a whole article on The Guardian saying how shocking the tone of the speech was. Because for a lot of people who are not in this specific, this little, the small world of Ukraine expertise, let's say, or even Russian expertise, the scale of Putin's obsession with Ukraine is shocking. It's not known really now. I think what he said yesterday, again, the context of what he said, the fact that the world was watching, alarmed people. I think people tuning into his speech were expecting to hear some sort of a kind of, a fairly dry diplomatic justification of why he was recognizing these territories. They were expecting to hear about Ukraine not living up perhaps to the Minsk Accords, Ukraine being guilty of whatever imaginary crimes he may decide upon yesterday, be it genocide or human rights or whatever it may have been. But they were expecting to see quite specific arguments about why he was taking this action, which was already signaled in advance. And instead, they received a almost 1 hour diatribe, just a sort of stream of consciousness, going back 1,000 years, explaining how bad Ukraine is.
Peter, sitting in Kyiv, how did you watch it?
I watched it online. I watched it at home online. And I was monitoring social media as the speech was going, and it was, it was live, the thing was lit up. People just, again, those in the know just say, sort of knowingly saying, look, he's doing it again. And those who didn't know clearly saying, oh my God, what's this guy saying? Again, I say, for those who are not familiar with his behavior towards Ukraine and what drives him, I think it was genuinely shocking. I think it did set off alarm bells, because it was a very, the Donbass was a minor issue. It was about Ukraine. It was uncomfortable viewing, extremely uncomfortable. Sitting in Kiev, it was very uncomfortable viewing, because he was essentially saying, that Ukraine has no legitimacy as a state. Ukraine has no real right to exist. I don't recognize it as a state. It is part of Russia. It is historically ours. It will be ours. It was, deeply, deeply disturbing, really. Even though I've been following this for years, and I've often commented on this specific feature. Even so, it seemed like a very odd thing for him to do at that point. Very odd and very, very ominous, very aggressive.
Very ominous. Peter, over the weekend, I wrote an essay. I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, when the Russians attacked in August of 2008. And for what we now know of the passage of time, there's a whole MO, there's a whole strategy there, a blueprint. And the war plan was drawn up in response to George Bush saying that Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO. That was in the NATO meeting in Bucharest in April of 2008. And the next week, we now know they drew up their war plan. June and July, the Russian railroad forces were strengthening that railroad down from Sochi into Sukhumi, Abkhazia, so they could carry tanks. They had they had their own maneuvers, Russian maneuvers, immediately north of Georgia, north of Rocky Tunnel area. Those ended on a Sunday. On the same day, they were evacuating women and children from South Ossetia. And Первый Kanal, Russia's channel, was there reporting hysterically. I remember watching in my Georgia hotel room. The reporter was hysterical. The women and children were not hysterical. They just thought they're going up to Northern Ossetia, Russia, for summer camp. Then the bombing started. And meanwhile, the Duma had asked Putin to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent nations. The shelling started. About 15 Georgian and police and soldiers were killed. And then apparently Saakashvili got intel that the troops are coming in through the Rocky Tunnel. And so then he fell for the bait and lashed back and occupied the capital, South Ossetia. So that was their MO in 2008. You've been watching this in Kyiv, what's been going on with Russia, and also the accusations of genocide. Then President Medvedev in Russia accused Georgia of genocide, of killing thousands of South Ossetians. 5 months after the war was over, the Moscow Prosecutor General's office came out and said 168 were killed, but the entire Russian media was saying genocide and thousands were killed, which Ossetians say made them sympathetic to the ethnic cleansing of Georgian villages, which have been there for hundreds of thousands of years in the area. So you have the war plan, the maneuvers are over, the shelling starts, the evacuation of the civilians, the genocide accusations. It really looks like what we've seen before. Oh, you also wait for the Olympics. That time he didn't wait for the Olympics to be open. He started with the Olympics on the first day of the Beijing Olympics, which obviously pissed off the Chinese. And so he didn't do that. He waited for the Olympics to be over. But Peter, from where you sit and your knowledge of history, can you connect the dots? Where are these dots leading to? What do you think will happen in coming days and weeks in Ukraine?
Well, I think the question now is which borders does Putin recognize within the East Ukrainian Oblast? So the two republics, these two puppet regimes that they've now recognized only occupy about 1/3 of the two administrative regions that they are located in, the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. So the question, but they claim all of them. They claim the whole regions. So the question is, will Putin recognize the full oblast boundaries or the de facto boundaries today? And the Russians have been very elusive on that today. They've been questioned on that. Peskov, the spokesman in the Kremlin, was questioned on that. I think there was a press conference today and he was questioned, I believe, 8 times, and 8 times he said no comment on that. All right, he gave very evasive answers. That's the key thing, I think, now in terms of how far Russia goes, because as it stands, Russia really hasn't gained very much. They already occupied these territories, but they did so unofficially, and they used them as leverage against Ukraine. Yesterday, Putin threw that leverage away. He just tossed it away. He has no leverage over Ukraine in relation to the Minsk Accords or reintegration into Ukraine. He basically occupied them for the long term. I mean, again, nothing's forever, perhaps, but it's hard to imagine them going back to Ukraine now. So he's sacrificed that leverage. So you would assume that he wants to get something more out of it. Now, is that going to be the rest of these two oblasts? Even that, to me, seems like a very poor return. I would assume that the plan is to go further into East Ukraine, or the other alternative plan would be to use the Russian troops in East Ukraine to spark a confrontation, and once the fighting in East Ukraine starts, then to launch a full-scale invasion.
Yeah, well,
that would be the most logical thing, with the goal not necessarily of occupying the whole country, but perhaps to decimate Ukraine's military capabilities and to force a regime change in Kyiv.
Right. Just to back up a little bit, I mean, Peter and Myroslava, you recall that during the time of the latest Nagorno-Karabakh war, the sticking point was the legal boundaries of Nagorno-Karabakh in Soviet Armenia as an autonomous area. So there was a lot of kind of legalism attached to those boundaries. Peter, 2 things. One is, as you know, I was doing the Ukraine financial news for many years, and 80% of Ukraine's imports and exports go out by sea. What are the prospects that the Russian fleet could simply blockade the ports in the Black Sea and the Azov? And once again, part of the claims to the historic area of Donetsk means taking Mariupol. I think you wrote that last night, which is maybe the 5th largest port in Ukraine. What are the prospects of a sea blockade, which is sort of painless? I mean, there aren't, dead people all over the place. You're just blockading ports.
Yeah, it would be arguably the smart money for the smart move for the Russians. It would be the easiest thing for them to do militarily. It would be the cheapest thing for them to do militarily. They've already now put the pieces in place. I don't imagine that the ships that have been moved to the Black Sea in the last 2 weeks will leave. I believe they'll stay there. Non-Black Sea nations are subject to extensive limitations into what they can bring into the Black Sea. The convention in place since the 1930s with Turkey places a lot of limitations there. So America can't just load up the Black Sea with ships, for example, or Britain or any other NATO nation. The only countries that can do what they want there, more or less, are Black Sea nations. Russia obviously counts as one. So I assume that they will maintain the presence there, and they have that option. It's not a very complex option. It would create potential problems legally, but Russia's disregard for international law is fairly open secret now. They don't really care, and I think Putin's been proved right in that. You know, he's broken international law repeatedly and had very minor costs to pay. So I think he assumes that this would be quite a cheap option, and then the pressure would be on Ukraine. The economic pressure would be huge, and it would really become. It would be effectively a siege. It would be a siege to see who would outlast, and much would depend on the readiness of the international community to pay for Ukraine. Yeah. Countries like Germany, who don't want to arm Ukraine, to say, okay, well, we will finance Ukraine, to start putting across big money to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat. And that's I think that's limited. You know, they might do that, but not perhaps long term.
Well, the biggest choke point are the Black Sea and those off ports. I did an editor's note last summer. Would NATO fight for Snake Island? And participant Snake Island is at the mouth of the Danube, but is Ukrainian. And if the Russians could invent a legal pretext because it was liberated by Soviet troops in '44, to take Snake Island, they would have almost a chain, which we did during the revolution, like chaining across the Hudson from one end of the Black Sea to the other of the Ukrainian ports. One thing, and participants, before I forget, please, I see several people have sent in questions. Please go ahead with the questions for Myroslava and Peter. Peter, I remember one time you and I had lunch in January, and I asked, what are you going to do for the Christmas holidays, the January holidays? You said you're going to read a biography of Churchill. Very impressive. So participants, all those books behind Peter, he's read. Okay, you read your biography of Churchill. I know it's an unfair comparison, but we have a wartime president now in Ukraine, Zelensky. How is he handling things, and are people rallying behind him? Sort of, my mother would say, faute de mieux, nothing better around. Elections are 2 years away. He's what we got. What's your take on Zelensky?
Well, I think there is a degree of. I think if we look broadly at how he's handled the conflict for the last few years, he's gone through quite a dramatic transformation. I mean, when he was campaigning in 2019, he was very naive. I think he did. I think genuinely believe that he could talk to Russia, that he could reason with them. Zelensky's background, I mean, Zelensky is a child of the Russian world, so to speak, in terms of the perception of the Russian speakers being part of a Russian cultural world, of a broader Russian society, which is so dear to Putin and his acolytes. Zelensky is very much part of that. His whole career was built about Russian language comedy and Russian language entertainment business throughout the former Soviet world and beyond. So he was very much involved in that and integrated into that community. And I think he believed that, based on his personal experience and his own worldview, that he'd be able to talk to the Russians, and it would actually just be a matter of sitting down and sharing some drinks perhaps, and a nice big feast, and just putting the world to rights. He spoke in the campaign, we just need to stop shooting, we need to sit down, we need to talk face to face. He's been disabused of all that now very seriously, very significantly. I think this was why he did turn quite notably a year ago with the closure of the Kremlin-linked TV channels, with the house arrest of Medvedchuk and a number of other measures. It became clear that he'd recognized there was no middle ground with Russia. Russia didn't want peace. Russia didn't want compromise. And he's since become more hawkish. if we know, so that's his general sort of trajectory that he's undergone, I think, and he's become, you know, he began it again when he came into power. You know, he was very much like downplaying national symbols of Ukraine and Ukrainian patriotism. Now he ends every speech with Slava Ukraina and all these, you know, the traditional symbolism of Ukraine. So he's become much more. He's bought into that a lot more, I think, largely through his own experience. In terms of his recent performance, I think that his calls for calm are understandable, but a risky policy. He's downplayed the threat of war consistently because he fears the economic damage it will cause, which is understandable and perhaps reasonable, but it's a very fine line to walk. I think he got a lot of credit for his performance last weekend at the Munich Security Conference. People who I know who don't like him at all, frankly, were impressed enough and were honest enough to say, "Wow, that was presidential. That was not even presidential. That was statesman-like." His speech there, that was impressive. So I think he's growing. I mean, you know, his learning curve is extremely steep. He had no political experience at all, and also he's very young. You know, and he came from a different world. So, and you know, he's no fool. He's a smart guy. He was very successful in his previous showbiz career, not just simply because he's cute or funny. He's very smart. He's astute. You know, he's nobody's fool, and he is learning. I think that the trajectory he's on is broadly quite positive. But having said that, I mean, I'm still not convinced he's a war leader, you know, and as things progress, you know, we'll see his real mettle. But he's not performed as badly as we may have feared he would at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I do see that Paula Dwyer, the head of the OPC, asked the very same question. So everyone, keep your questions coming in. Myroslava, as you know, Zelensky's top two rivals, Poroshenko and Medvedchuk, are being indicted or on trial for treason one way or the other. If you look at your friends and family, how are they seeing Zelensky? Are they kind of softening on him, realize he's all we have? Are they kind of holding their nose and backing him? I mean, he is the man of the hour. How are attitudes changing or evolving towards Zelensky that you're seeing among the people you know?
Well, I think in this instance, it's best for me to talk about my own opinion because I'm not really sure that I should be speaking for other people. I mean, I certainly have a great deal of respect for President Zelensky. We talked in the beginning about the resilience and the stoicism of the Ukrainian people right now in the wake of the crisis. I think that is actually something quite new, not to say that the Ukrainian people are not courageous and stoic and have put up with a lot of crap over the past centuries, but this kind of public call to calm is something that is quite new. And we saw that coming out of the pandemic. He was certainly very good with regular video addresses via his social media channels, telling people kind of the situation and the measures that were being taken. So I think that was a good platform to establish that kind of relationship, that kind of new format, kind of digital Ukraine relationship with the nation. I think are really, really important. I mean, I would say two really important reforms of his that have been game changers. Firstly, the infrastructural projects, Велике будівництво and Велика реставрація. So knitting Ukraine together through a network of new and improved roads. I mean, that has been an absolute game changer. And this is something that no previous administration has not just attempted, but done. I mean, he has progressed a lot along that. And the second one was, of course, the introduction of the app Dia, which is, well, it's the Ukrainian word for action. So it's an app that allows you to do everything from applying for a wedding certificate registration to applying for a driving license, registering births, deaths, really a whole wide of bureaucratic services, which quite often before were enfolded in corruption at the lowest, at the most local lowest level and at the highest level. So introducing this degree of transparency and sort of cutting these corrupt networks in one fell swoop, I think has been a game changer. So I think he's very much a digital president, as well as someone who I think has already shown their mettle as a statesman. I mean, his Munich speech was very much Ukraine showing that, you know, she may be a beauty, but she's going to decide whether or not she's going to, you know, sit at table and feast with her so-called friends, you know, show us the goods, you know, we're happy, we're grateful for all help, but also we need to know where we're at. We're in the gray zone. Yeah. And in terms of going back to the narratives that I kind of outlined in my presentation, you know, the idea that culture no longer equals politics. You may be a Russian speaker, but that does not make you a Russian supporter. Having said that, it's a kind of, you know, it wouldn't be fair to say that no Russian speaker in Ukraine is a Russian supporter. You know, some Russian speakers in Ukraine are Russian supporters, but not all. Certainly far fewer than, you know, in the last years. And I think Zelensky is an example of someone that, looking at their profile, the fact that he comes from a Russian-speaking city, you know, to the east of the country, the fact that he has, you know, cut his teeth in Russian language comedy, the fact that he has had, you know, most of his commercially successful projects were in fact in Russia. You would expect that he would have a much more accommodating attitude towards Russia, but he has not shown that during his presidency. And I think, you know, he represents a lot of Ukrainians who may have been open to, you know, dialogue, but now we don't believe any of Russia's promises. We are much more skeptical, I think, now.
Great. Thank you, Myroslava. A lot of excellent points there. And I agree with you entirely. I think the roads program and the DIA, the digitalization, are real game changers for Ukraine. And participants, the DIA program is basically trying to do what Estonia has been doing, but bringing it a generation ahead to creating a digital society and cutting out a lot of the bureaucracy. And Zelensky has been 150% behind that, along with the road program, which is obviously a huge vote getter. We've been getting some, so you've got two questions, and please keep the questions coming. China, and my friend Walter Colton, my friend William Holstein have been asking the panelists, where do you see the role of China? And I was asked on a TV news show, and I said, well, you know, China is the largest trading partner of Ukraine, but it's a lot more sophisticated than that. And that is interesting that China has displaced Russia in the last 8 years as the largest trading partner of Ukraine. Russia's tumbled down to third place behind either Germany or Poland, depending on whether they're measuring imports or exports. Peter, Myroslava, what do you see the role of China in days ahead? And they're treading a very fine line, but and one question says, will China tell Russia not to move out of the areas it controls in eastern Ukraine? I leave that to you.
Well, China in previous crises has been exceptionally critical of any sort of violation of sovereign borders agreed upon by international law. Obviously, you know, China's stance has been very legalistic in these matters, but whether or not we will see an extrapolation of that, given everything that's going on. I mean, obviously, everybody has their eyes on Taiwan and what's going to happen there, and whether China will mirror Russia's expansionist stance. In the case of the Nepal blockade, we might actually see, I think, a new type of hybrid warfare, where it's not so much a traditional blockade as a disruption to Ukraine's trade flow going in and out, Obviously, why that is significant is because of the many agreements that Ukraine has signed with countries, including China, taking on the responsibility of supplying things like grain and I mean other exports, not only agricultural but some industrial as well. So if Ukraine is unable to meet the clauses of the many trade contracts that she signed, Ukraine will have to, will most likely face consequences, both short-term and long-term disruption to the economic ties that Ukraine has successfully built over the years. Worryingly, though, we have seen in the metrics that Russia remains an important trade partner for Ukraine. There is, and I mean, Jim, you might be able to comment better on that, but there is an enormous volume of trade going on with Russia. I mean, in the tens of billions of dollars, I believe, annually, which is ongoing despite the war and despite the current crisis. I mean, in culture, we have seen that polemic with Ukrainian artists, whether secretly or openly, performing in the Crimea, illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. And of course, Russia proper. Russia remains one of the main consumers of Ukrainian cultural exports. Mm-hmm. And we see that, we see the most curious cases. Like there is a really famous pastry chef called Alexander Seleznyov, who is based in Monaco. And I think he represents that generation of Russians who prefer to spend their time outside of Russia, but who is kind of very culturally Russian. And he talks about how he comes back from his pastry shop every day, and he kicks back for 2 hours watching Ukrainian series. And I mean, that's something very new. The fact that Ukraine has now produced enough kind of trash TV to ensnare Russian viewers shows that Ukraine is doing something right. Yeah. Whether or not, again, that emphasizes that Ukraine is a sovereign state, will choose to remain independent and will fight to the death for her land and her people. That remains to be seen. I don't think Russia is really getting that message. And I think a lot of the debates, and this is, Jim, something that you mentioned in your talk recently, we don't actually know how good the information that Putin is getting is, whether his yes men are suggesting that Ukrainians are waiting to welcome Russian tanks with flowers, with floral garlands. That's something that is worrying, whether he actually overestimates how much the Ukrainian people are longing to be liberated. Peter, in terms of what you said about Zelensky now becoming more patriotic, I don't think that he wasn't patriotic. I just think that the modality of the expression of patriotism has changed. I think he wanted to kind of mark a change from Poroshenko when it was kind of overtly militaristic and perhaps nationalistic, towards a kind of calmer, more kind of, I'd say, muted and less overtly religious and rhetorical kind of expression. But yeah, the fact that he's doing it now in this crisis, we have seen that change. And I think, one way that I've tried to illustrate that change is the slide kind of contrasting, official art circa 2000, Ukraine on a massive column with a Corinthian golden column, and sort of the more kind of steampunk, yes, this is Ukraine, we have suffered, but we're still kind of partying. Now is certainly not the time to party, and now is probably the right time for Zelensky to choose to be kind of more overtly patriotic in his speech. Yeah, but he's not overdone it.
Yeah, no, I agree. That statue of the column could have been raised in 1918, the first Ukrainian republic. Very, very good points, Myroslava, and thanks. And Peter, China, what are you thinking? China imports a lot of grain and participants. Ukraine is one of the world's 5 largest food powers as measured in internationally traded food, largely grains and sunflower oil. But they get a lot of iron pellets from Ukraine, since they have problems. The Chinese have problems with Australia. That said, I think Taiwan has all of a sudden elevated Ukraine to the A-list, in that people realize that if Ukraine, that if the West steps on the ball with Ukraine, it's a green light for China to take Taiwan, to be blunt. And I think that message has gotten through to the people in the Biden administration, Boris Johnson, and hopefully to people in Germany and France. Peter, China, what do you think, how do you think China is going to play it in the next few days and weeks?
I don't anticipate they'll be very involved, frankly. I think that they are fundamentally against any drama in general in terms of international relations. I think they are perhaps the ultimate stability state. They've spoken about the need to respect international borders. They've always paid lip service to that, even going back to 2014 rather. But having said that, they've also abstained or voted with Russia at the UN. Their relationship with Russia is very important. I think that's much more important for China than their relationship with Ukraine. So they will not upset that for Ukraine or for the West or for a respect for international relations. So I think they'll stand down. I don't think they'll get very involved. The economic relationship between China and Ukraine is significant, though. I think specifically because it's a food relationship. I think China is, Ukraine is playing a more prominent role in China's food security. And that's interesting in itself. And China has also begun to invest more in Ukraine in terms of infrastructure, in terms of putting down longer routes. And Chinese planning tends to be of a very long-term nature. And so I think it's reasonable to say that China now views Ukraine as a partner, both in terms of agriculture and food security, and also in terms of infrastructure and trade ties with the EU, with Europe, essentially, as a platform, as a transit country for trade with the EU. So they're not totally indifferent, but I wouldn't expect them to get directly involved. I think if we talk about the economic factors here, Ukraine's role as a food producer, I like to refer to Ukraine as an emerging agricultural superpower. Because I like these tabloid terms to sort of capture the imagination of outside audiences. But I think that's a very relevant term. I think they are genuinely. Yeah. The figures reflect that. It needs to be understood internationally how big Ukraine is. It's in the top 5 in a whole row of key agricultural categories as an exporter. It's the number 4 exporter to the EU. So if Ukraine were to be, plunged into a very large military campaign, and that trade, or a blockade, and that trade were to be stopped, the consequences would be considerable around the world. They'd be feeling that in a lot of countries would all of a sudden see, 20% of their grain or 30% of their sunflower or whatever it may be would be gone, and that would have a huge knock-on effect. It would cause food shortages, it would cause price hikes, and it would lead to instability. That could be a factor across North Africa, the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be, and then that has a knock-on effect in terms of the potential to spark migration waves coming into the EU, et cetera. So, the butterfly effect of Ukraine being blockaded or disrupted could be very significant. China's part of that, but I don't think it's perhaps the main thing. I think that we need to look elsewhere for the keys to that, and it would be very significant. And to be honest, we have seen articles about this in the last few weeks in the press. This is something that thankfully people seem to be more aware of, and they're starting to say in advance, this is what it could mean. Whereas during previous crises, there seems to have been a much less awareness of that sort of thing.
Yeah, the World Food Program tracks world food prices, and they've been up in the last few years. And, a country like Egypt, which depends heavily on Black Sea grain, largely from Ukraine, they get very sensitive to the price of wheat going up and price of bread going up. India is the largest importer of sunflower oil and sunflower seed, and Ukraine is the largest exporter. These are very sensitive to the common people in India. So I agree with you that there is a real sensitivity there. And we know why the Nazis invaded Ukraine is because of the Black Earth, because they wanted to get the grain, the bread basket of Europe. If we could shift degrees a little bit, Albert Goldson asks about the he notes, Albert is a member of the OPC board, that Russia has revoked a protocol about the protection of victims of international armed conflicts. And how would this protect Ukrainians maybe taken prisoner in partisan warfare? And it's a little bit of a fine point. And maybe, Brian, you could take a shot at that, and welcome back. And before we get there, I'd like to tell panelists that in the, I guess it was 6 years I lived in Ukraine, no one ever migrated. No one moved to the Russian-controlled sections. It was kind of like asking a South Korean, well, why don't you move to North Korea if you don't like it? I mean, it really, people would go to the Russian-controlled sections, to bring money to their families or to bring their families out. And there's been massive emigration from those areas. And one reason why in some areas in 2013, 2014, there's sort of fuzzy feeling like, oh, well, maybe better to take over by Russia. You know, I'm talking about Odessa and Kharkiv. That's gone because people have been able to watch for the last 8 years how Russia has managed these areas. They're economically dead. There's no free press. There's no free elections. There are torture camps. And there's massive emigration. And a lot of people live there are pensioners because the option is to stay in your apartment in Donetsk or live under a bridge in Kyiv. I mean, I don't mean to be that dramatic, but they have their house, so they stay there. But people vote with their feet, and virtually no Ukrainians have migrated out of ideological sympathy or whatever to Donetsk and Luhansk, to the controlled areas. Brian, you have a good handle on politics. If we have partisan warfare developing, how do you think Russia would treat its prisoners, and how do you think they would fight against a guerrilla warfare in Ukraine? I'm not talking about Western Ukraine, we know the history, I'm talking about Eastern Ukraine.
Well, sure, Jim, and just to add to your point about Odessa and Kharkiv, I do recall in 2014 having dinner with a group of businessmen, one of which was Jewish, and the topic had come up about, you know, Crimea and what the destabilization efforts. And he said, Brian, don't worry about Odessa. Odessa's never going to join Russia. Now, if the question was about joining Israel, no, that's something to consider. But some good Odessan humor there for you. But I mean, that's a real question. I mean, there have been Ukrainian prisoners, you know, there's constant prisoner exchanges going on. And this has been an issue. You know, most of the people that the Ukrainian prisoners have been imprisoned by the Russians. And, you know, this is not exactly Scandinavian prison treatment here. This is, it's pretty tough. I know some people who've done time in Russian prisons, not just military, but civilians. And so we can imagine, you know, what little adherence Russia has to international law and international treaties. You know, even if they are signatories to certain treaties and procedures, we can expect, though, that the prisoners are not going to be treated well. I think it's safe to say to expect the worst. And you know, British intelligence released a few days ago the report, I believe it was Thursday last week, about, you know, planned assassinations and list of Ukrainians who would be rounded up and targeted for removal. So anytime you have a country, you know, putting out assassination list, that does not bode well for anyone who's going to be a potential prisoner of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I've been down to Luhansk and Donetsk, to the government-controlled areas. If there's a breakthrough, do you think some individuals will wave their hand in the air and say, well, I'll be mayor for the Russian-controlled Donetsk? Or do you think most of them will keep their heads down and many will just kind of emigrate out of the area? I mean, how do you think the population there will react to a Russian onslaught?
Well, you know, there certainly will be people who say, yeah, this is my chance. I want to, you know, I've been waiting for this. Now's my time. You know, brother Russia has come to liberate me. But I think two things. One, there'll certainly be those people, and let's let's use a phrase, to describe them, I would say we would be naive not to think that Russia does not have sleeper cells of people who, have been waiting for such a scenario. Now, the issue for those people, though, is if you look at the LNR, DNR, all the leaders are imported. They're not locals, right? So the LNR, DNR leadership is imported from Russia. So I think Ukrainians who are thinking that, Russia was going to recognize their great talents and trust them to administer some of these, cities or regions in the case it goes that far, I think they're naive, and I think they're deluding themselves. Russia will almost certainly have their handpicked people put in place in these towns and cities. The greater the importance of the city, the greater the likelihood it'll be a handpicked person from Moscow.
So there will be no quislings. The Norwegian leader under the Nazi occupation in Norway, who I think ended up executed in 1946. So it's not a good. I hope they have life insurance, but I don't think there's much of a future of that. Folks, we try to keep it to 11 o'clock. Why don't we just go around the clock for some final words? Peter, you're sitting there in the middle. Any thoughts? If you could help our participants move forward, what do you think we're going to see in the next week, 10 days, 2 weeks?
Well, I think that all eyes are, the immediate future is, of course, the sanctions, which I think are coming out as we speak, and we need to see how severe they are. That will determine, that will have a significant impact, I think. But the ultimate sanction, the ultimate deterrent remains Ukraine's ability to defend itself. So I think in parallel to seeing sanctions imposed on Russia in the next, the coming hours, coming days, I think we also will be looking to see the West with its support for Ukraine, certainly in terms of arms, hopefully also financial support, not just kind words and moral support. I think they need very significant material support. That will determine, because ultimately that's what deters Putin. I think ultimately he doesn't really care that much about sanctions. He doesn't really care about, he's more than happy to accept economic pain if he can achieve what he sees as a historic mission. This is a holy quest for him. This is a crusade, and he's not worried about the share price of Gazprom. He's not going to be deterred by that. So that's going to be key in the next few days. My ultimate overall forecast, I think, is quite grim, but I think Ukraine will come through. We're going to have dark days ahead, that's for sure. But ultimately, I remain an optimist. I think Ukraine has long since passed the point of no return in terms of the ultimate statehood test. And I think Putin is basically in cloud cuckoo land now with his speeches. He's what would have seemed menace, what would have seemed perhaps it's still menacing today, but what would have seemed perhaps more dreadful in the 1990s or early 2000s now just seems insane. Frankly, his rants seem less likely to be that of a man who's totally out of touch. So he's a very dangerous figure, but I think he's hopelessly out of touch with where Ukraine is today.
I agree with you, and there is a dichotomy. I think the FT brought this up between, is it Vladimir the Rational or is it Mad Vlad? I think we're seeing Mad Vlad right now.
I think it's real. I think it's real, but there are limits. He's not an all-powerful, absolute monarch. At the end of the day, I still do believe there's people in Russia who can, restrain him, and ultimately people have to carry out his orders. There may still come a point where people say, no, I won't do that. That's also a factor. He's not as secure as people think.
And I think participants, it's important to know that probably 1 million Russians have relatives in Ukraine. I know comparison may not be fair, but it's like Americans and Canadians. It's always been an open border. It's always been a lot of amity until this recent time. Myroslava, why don't you give us your 30 seconds of thoughts, then we'll go to Brian. What are you thinking looking ahead to bring people forward? What do you think we might see the next week or month or so?
Okay, well, in August last year, contemporary Ukraine as a sovereign state celebrated 30 years of independence. And that seems like a significant date, a nice round date. Of course, Ukrainian statehood has roots that go back centuries. You know, you can start it in the 9th century, you know, with the foundation of the medieval city-state of the Kiev Rus. Now I believe in Russia, it's no longer called the Kievan Rus, it's called the ancient Russian state, Древнерусское государство, not Kievskaya Rus. So, you know, we can go back, of course, to the Cossack state, when the hetmans had the power and a lot of military under their control. You know, we can certainly go back to examples, historic examples from the 20th century. I mean, Jim mentioned the Ukrainian Republic, 1918. I think the most important takeaway is that Ukrainians find justification of their statehood in themselves in the present day. You can choose examples from history, recent and ancient, but the most important thing is that Ukrainians believe that they are Ukrainians in 2022 and part of an independent sovereign state. And we don't have to ask anyone permission to feel that way. And we are ready to fight for that. And culture has certainly played a part in this, but less and less so. Less and less do we see political affinity flowing out of cultural affinity. And I think it's paradoxical that Russians can happily consume Ukrainian cultural products and Ukrainians can happily consume Russian cultural products, whether recent or older, and still very much feel like, for Ukrainians, that they are a distinct nation, and for Russians to feel like, well, Ukrainians are quite welcome into the big Russian cultural family. So I think it's very important to keep culture and politics distinct in this case. Otherwise, it may lead to all sorts of confusion, and Vlad the Mad has been playing on that.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Myroslava. Very good points. And Brian, why don't we give you the last word? And in about 1 minute or so, where do you think things are going to evolve on the ground in Ukraine the next week or month?
I'd say this week is going to be tense. I believe it. I've probably been jaded for 22 years of living here, but I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. Today is the 8-year anniversary of the victory of Euromaidan, which is in and of itself an existential threat to Vladimir Putin and his reign. And so we don't know what's going to happen tonight on the borders. The second thing to keep in mind is tomorrow is the 23rd, which is Soviet Army Day, which is another wonderful date if you are a Russian military official. So I say all that to say this, do numbers matter? Well, debate it back and forth, but they matter for certain people in the circle of Vladimir Putin. So I would think those events alone, in addition to yesterday's events with the recognition of the LNR, DNR, tell me that the next 72 to 96 hours are going to be pretty rough. I think until we get, President Biden and Putin in Paris face to face. So until that happens, I think, unfortunately, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Yeah, good. Listen, I want Myroslava, Peter, Brian, I want to thank you very much. I know it's super busy and pretty tense where you are, but it's been a real privilege for all of us to hear from you in Ukraine, inside Ukraine, about Ukraine today and what people are thinking and trying to spin it forward where we're going. And Patty, I leave you to say the closing words. I would possibly propose that we do this again in 2 or 3 weeks. It's really been very illuminating. And I'll say one final thing. There's a group of people pushing the idea that the Russian sphere of influence concept, that Ukraine is part of the Russian sphere of influence. Ambassador Matlock, Graham, Henry Kissinger, their ages are respectively something like 82, 86, and 98. And I have I don't cast shade on these 3 men. They were at the top of their game. They had the best information. They were at the top of their institutions 30 years ago. And what's happened this morning, our morning, your afternoon, is you have told us about Ukraine today, which has moved on and has moved forward and doesn't have a lot to do with Ukraine of 1991 and the chicken Kyiv speech Ukraine
1991. So I'll leave with that. And Patty, once again, if our panelists are game, that maybe in 2 or 3 weeks we do this again. I think there's going to be a lot of, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of news between now and then. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Jim, for suggesting the panel and moderating. We'll be on touch about what happens next, and in both Ukraine and the OPC. But thank you, everyone.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Stay safe. Bye.